Hi, I'm Emily. I'll be your storyteller today. Many of you use these stories to fall asleep. So before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Also, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now get comfortable. Close your eyes and let the sound of the rain guide you into the story. My fascination has always been with the bones of communication, the forgotten skeletons of language left behind by the relentless march of progress. As a linguistics student, I found more beauty in the rigid grammar of Latin than in any modern slang, more intrigue in the elegant curves of calligraphy than in the cold pixels of a screen. It was this passion that led me to choose Blackwood Hall as my dormitory, a grand Gothic dowager of a building, its stone walls saturated with over a century of academic whispers and the constant mournful sigh of the coastal rain. The dorm, once a prestigious private academy in the late 19th century, was a labyrinth of echoing corridors, high ceilings, and rooms that had resisted all attempts at complete modernization. Its heart, however, was the basement, a vast, subterranean maze of stone archways and forgotten storage rooms, a place most students avoided but that I found endlessly compelling. It was a tomb of discarded knowledge, filled with old furniture, forgotten scientific equipment, and the dusty remnants of lives long since past. It was on a particularly bleak and rainy Tuesday afternoon that I descended into its depths, seeking a trunk of winter clothes I had stored away. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, mildew, and decaying paper, a familiar, almost comforting perfume to me. My footsteps echoed in the profound quiet, the only other sound the rhythmic drip of water from a sweating pipe somewhere. In the darkness, a sound like a slow, patient clock. My designated storage cage was in one of the deeper, less visited sections, a place where the bare stone walls were slick with moisture, and the single caged bulb overhead cast more shadow than light. As I was fumbling with the rusty padlock on my cage, my flashlight beam played over a nearby corner, illuminating a large, shapeless form huddled beneath a heavy, dust-caked canvas tarp. It was an object I had never noticed before, despite my many explorations of this subterranean world. Curiosity, as always, got the better of me. Leaving my trunk for a moment, I approached the shrouded object, the air around it seeming colder, stiller. I tugged at the corner of the heavy tarp. It was stiff, resistant, but it finally gave way, releasing a cloud of ancient dust that danced like frantic ghosts in my flashlight beam. And there, revealed beneath it, sat the most beautiful, anachronistic object I had ever seen. An antique telegraph machine. It was a magnificent specimen from the Victorian era, its brass fittings tarnished to a deep, soulful bronze, its wooden base a rich, dark mahogany, its intricate mechanism surprisingly intact despite the decades of neglect. It was a solid, weighty thing, a testament to an age of communication that was deliberate, physical, and deeply resonant. Though its wires had long since been severed, leaving it isolated and silent, it seemed to possess a dormant, waiting energy. I was utterly captivated. This was not just a piece of equipment. It was a tangible piece of history, a direct link to the hands and minds that had once operated it, to the urgent, hopeful, or sorrowful messages that had once pulsed through its silent brass heart. As a student of linguistics, of the very mechanics of how we connect, this machine was a perfect, irresistible relic. I knew, with an immediate and unshakable certainty, that I had to have it. The process of hauling the heavy machine up 3 flights of winding stairs to my small dorm room was arduous, but I was fueled by a strange, exhilarating energy. It felt less like moving a piece of antique furniture, and more like rescuing a forgotten soul. bringing it out of the damp, silent darkness of the basement and back into a place where it could be seen, admired, and perhaps understood. I spent the rest of the afternoon meticulously, lovingly, cleaning it. I polished the tarnished brass until it gleamed with a soft, warm light, oiled the silent, intricate mechanisms of its key and sounder, and wiped away the layers of dust from its beautiful mahogany base. By the time I was finished, it sat on a small table in my room, a proud, silent monarch from a forgotten kingdom, its presence lending my modern, cluttered dorm room an air of unexpected gravitas and history. That evening, my friend Leo, a pragmatic history major who often regarded my fascination with dead languages and obsolete toys with a kind of amused tolerance, stopped by. His eyes widened slightly when he saw the telegraph machine gleaming in the lamplight. "Wow, Helena," he said, running a finger over its polished surface. "Where did you dig this up? The University Museum?" I explained my discovery in the basement, my excitement bubbling over as I described its craftsmanship, its history, its role as a nexus of communication. Leo listened with his usual patient smile. "It's a beautiful piece, I'll give you that," he admitted. "A real museum-quality artifact. But what are you going to do with it? It's not like you can exactly send a telegram." "It's not about using it, Leo," I tried to explain. "It's about what it represents, the history it holds, the voices that passed through it." He chuckled, shaking his head. "All right, you and your voices. Just make sure you don't start trying to decipher phantom messages from the great beyond." His words were a joke, a piece of gentle ribbing, but they would later return to me with a chilling, prophetic accuracy. After Leo left, a severe thunderstorm, which had been threatening all day, finally broke over Oak Haven. The wind howled around, the old stone walls of Blackwood Hall, and the rain lashed against my window pane in furious horizontal sheets. The power in the old dormitory flickered once, twice, then steadied, a common occurrence during such storms. I settled in with a book, the sounds of the tempest, a wild, dramatic symphony outside. It was around midnight, as the storm reached its peak, that I first heard it. A single sharp metallic click from the corner where the telegraph machine sat. I froze, my eyes darting towards it. The room was silent again, save for the roar of the storm. I must have imagined it, I told myself. A sound from outside, a branch hitting the window, a trick of the wind. Then it came again. Click, click, click. It was unmistakable, rhythmic, deliberate, precise. It was the sound of the telegraph key, the sounder arm striking the anvil, tapping out a message. My heart leaped into my throat. The machine was unplugged, its wires severed for decades, its mechanism silent for what must have been half a century or more. Yet it was undeniably, impossibly working. Driven by a fear that was quickly being eclipsed by an intense academic curiosity, I scrambled for my phone, my hands trembling as I activated its audio recorder. I had to capture this impossible phenomenon. I placed the phone beside the machine, its microphone aimed at the clicking sounder, and listened, mesmerized, as the invisible, ghostly operator continued to tap out its silent, spectral message into the storm-racked night. The clicking continued for several long minutes, a steady, rhythmic stream of dots and dashes, a clear, coherent transmission from an unseen, unknown source. The storm outside raged, lightning momentarily illuminating my small room, casting the telegraph machine in a stark, dramatic relief, its brass arm rising and falling, powered by the storm's energy, or by something else entirely, something far older and more mysterious. Finally, as suddenly as it had begun, the tapping ceased. The machine fell silent once more. A beautiful, inert object on my table. But the air in the room was different, charged with the energy of that impossible communication. The silence that followed was no longer empty. It was filled with the resonant echo of that ghostly message, with 1,000 unspoken questions. I did not yet know what the message said, what words had been carried on that silent spectral line from a forgotten past into my tumultuous present. But I had the recording. My linguist's mind, my archivist's soul, burned with a desperate need to translate, to understand, to decipher the first words spoken by the ghosts of Blackwood Hall. The storm outside began to subside, its fury abating, leaving only the soft, steady weeping of the rain. I sat in the quiet of my room, staring at the silent telegraph machine, the audio file a precious, terrifying artifact on my phone. My search for a tangible piece of history had yielded something far more profound and far more frightening. An impossible communication had begun, and I, its sole terrified recipient, was about to become the archivist of a whole new kind of forgotten language. The morning after the storm was unnaturally quiet, the air scrubbed clean and the sky a pale, exhausted gray. But the silence in my room was no longer peaceful. It was charged, filled with the resonant echo of the telegraph's impossible, spectral transmission. I hadn't slept, my mind a whirlwind of fear and a thrilling, almost feverish academic curiosity. The audio file on my phone, a recording of that ghostly Morse code, felt like the most important discovery of my life, a direct, inexplicable link to the past. My first task was translation. With a pot of strong black tea at my side, I began the meticulous process of transcribing the recording, a series of sharp metallic clicks into the dots and dashes of Morse code. Then, with a well-worn translation key from one of my historical linguistics textbooks, I started to decipher the message. My heart pounded with anticipation, my hands trembling slightly as I revealed the first words from across the century-long void. The initial messages were surprisingly, almost disappointingly, mundane. Weather fair. Wind from northeast. Shipment of textiles arrived. Dock 4. Market price for wheat holding steady. Greetings to Aunt Martha. Hope cough is improved. These were the prosaic, everyday whispers of a world long since vanished, the forgotten circulatory system of a 19th century city. Yet, their very mundanity, transmitted by an unplugged machine, was profoundly miraculous. A strange, almost obsessive routine began to take shape. Every night, especially when the air was damp or a fresh wave of rain swept over Oakhaven, the telegraph would awaken. It would tap out its silent messages for a few minutes, or sometimes an hour, always in that same steady, deliberate rhythm, as if dictated by a patient, ghostly hand. And every night, I would be there, my phone recording, my mind ready to capture these impossible echoes from the wire. My own studies began to suffer, my thesis on Proto-Indo-European verb roots gathering dust on my desk. How could I focus on the theoretical reconstruction of ancient languages when a living, breathing ghost of a more recent language was actively communicating in my own room? The telegraph became my sole focus, its rusted tin and silent brass, far more compelling subject than any textbook. My world shrank to the confines of my room and the nightly arrival of these spectral transmissions. I shared my initial findings with Leo, my history student friend. the skepticism a necessary anchor to my own soaring, incredible theories. I played him the recordings, showed him my meticulous transcriptions and translations. He was fascinated. I could see it in his eyes. But his mind, ever the pragmatist, immediately began searching for logical, scientific explanations, however improbable. "It has to be radio waves, Helena," he argued, examining the disconnected wires of the telegraph. "Some kind of freak interference. Maybe the metal frame is acting as a crude crystal radio receiver, picking up stray AM signals that are bouncing off the atmosphere during the storms. There's no ghost in the machine, just physics." His explanation was plausible, comforting, yet it didn't feel right. The messages were too coherent, too personal. Then, as I transcribed more and more of the nightly transmissions, a new, startling pattern began to emerge. The messages were not random echoes, not a jumble of different signals caught in a storm. They were chronological. One night's transmission of market prices would be followed the next night by messages detailing the arrival of those same goods at the port a day later. I was not just listening to random signals. I was listening to a timeline, a day-by-day account of a single specific period in the late 1880s. This discovery deepened the mystery immeasurably. A radio receiver might pick up random signals, but how could it receive them in a perfect, linear, historical progression? It was as if I had tapped into a recorded stream of the past, a spectral archive that was playing back for me, its sole audience, one night at a time. The telegraph was not just a receiver, it was a library, and I was its first and only patron. Presented this new finding to Leo, who frowned, his own logical explanations beginning to fray at the edges. "A chronological playback? That doesn't make any sense, from a physics perspective," he admitted, a new note of genuine bewilderment in his voice. Unless it's not a live signal, but some kind of imprinted data, like a message stored in the metal itself, being released by the storms. Even he could see the fantastical nature of his own theory. For weeks, the messages continued their mundane, historical progression. Weather reports, shipping news, brief, formal personal greetings. The world of 1888, with its gaslights and horse-drawn carts, its triumphs and its minor, everyday concerns, unfolded before me in a nightly stream of dots and dashes. I felt like a time traveler, a silent, unseen observer of a world long since turned to dust. I began to feel I knew the anonymous operators, their distinct rhythms, their professional brevity. Then, one night, the tone shifted. The usual stream of commercial and personal messages was interrupted by a new, more urgent, and unsettlingly somber conversation. "Line west, 7 unresponsive," the first operator tapped out. "Signal is dead, complete silence." A pause, then a reply, from another unknown operator. "Checked junction. Power is good. The fault is not electrical, a coldness on the wire, beyond the river." My fingers froze above my translation pad. A coldness on the wire. The phrase was poetic, chilling, and utterly out of place amidst the usual prosaic traffic reports and market prices. This was not a technical description of a fault. It was something else, something that spoke of a deep, almost superstitious dread. The rain outside my window, which had been a gentle patter, seemed to suddenly intensify, lashing against the glass. The next night, the worried conversation continued, more frantic this time. "Still silence from West 7. Jenkins has not reported." And the static. It sounds like whispers. Am I going mad? The other operator replied, "We all hear it. The shadow on the line. It is stronger tonight. A shadow on the line. The phrase made my blood run cold, echoing with a dread that felt both ancient and terrifyingly immediate. I felt a profound sense of connection to these long-dead men, their fear reaching across the century, transmitted through these impossible clicks. I was no longer a detached observer. I was a participant in their growing terror, a witness to a historical tragedy as it unfolded, night by agonizing night. The comforting charm of the telegraph's messages had vanished, replaced by a grim, unfolding horror story. On the third night of this new, terrifying narrative, the most chilling message yet came through, tapped out with a speed and urgency that felt like pure panic. Operator Jenkins on Western Line. No longer responding, it began. Sent boy to check. Line is cold. Fear the shadow has taken him. God help us. It is coming. The message ended there, abruptly, followed by a long, profound, and utterly final silence from the machine. Operator Jenkins. A name. A potential victim. And the shadow. No longer just a source of unsettling static, but a thing that could take people. The historical record had transformed into a ghost story, a chronicle of a supernatural assault on the very men who had first tended this building's complex web of communication. The rain outside was now a furious torrential downpour, as if the sky itself were weeping for the fate of Operator Jenkins. I stared at the silent telegraph machine, my own fear a cold, hard knot in my chest. The story was no longer about the past. It was about this machine, this room, this building. The faulty line, the shadow, the coldness on the wire, these were not historical anomalies. They were the first recorded encounters with the very entity I suspected that had awoken the machine for me, its newest, most unwilling listener. The silence from the telegraph was more terrifying than its frantic clicking had been. Had the transmission simply ended for the night? Or had the operator who sent that last, desperate message also been taken by the shadow? Was I listening to the last recorded words of a dying man? A voice from the brink of some terrible, unknown abyss? My scholarly project, my fascinating historical puzzle, had become a source of profound personal dread. The echoes on the wire were no longer charming fragments of a forgotten world, but dire warnings, spectral voices crying out from a past that felt increasingly, terrifyingly, not past at all. The shadow on the line was listening, and now it knew that I was listening too. The telegraph machine remained silent for 3 long, agonizing nights following the final, frantic message about the disappearance of Operator Jenkins. The silence was a new form of torment, a heavy, expectant void where the rhythmic clicking had once been. I existed in a state of suspended dread, rereading my translations of the Holloway family's tragic, unfolding nightmare, my mind a whirlwind of fear and unanswered questions. The rain had ceased, leaving behind a damp, cloying fog that shrouded Blackwood Hall in a ghostly white embrace. Self-correction. My apologies. The reference to the Holloway family was a bleed-through from the previous story, the memory projector. I will correct this to be specific to the Silent Line lore. The telegraph machine remained silent for 3 long, agonizing nights, following the final frantic message about the disappearance of Operator Jenkins. The silence was a new form of torment, a heavy, expectant void where the rhythmic clicking had once been. I existed in a state of suspended dread, rereading my translations of the operator's growing terror, my mind a whirlwind of fear and unanswered questions. The rain had ceased, leaving behind a damp, cloying fog that shrouded Blackwood Hall in a ghostly white embrace. I tried to focus on my linguistics studies, to lose myself in the comforting, predictable structures of ancient grammar, but the effort was futile. Every academic text seemed to mock me, its theories of communication so inadequate in the face of the impossible spectral transmissions I had recorded. The world of my studies felt like a distant, naive dream compared to the horrifying reality that now sat silently on the table in the corner of my room, a beautiful, menacing, and now silent enigma. Then, the phantom clicks began. At first they were faint, almost imperceptible, a tiny tick at the edge of my hearing that I would dismiss as a house settling or a twitch in my own tired ear. But they grew more persistent, more distinct. It was the unmistakable sound of a telegraph sounder, yet the machine itself remained perfectly, maddeningly still. The clicks seemed to come from the corners of the room, from the ancient radiator pipes, from within the very walls themselves. The haunting, it seemed, was no longer confined to the machine. It had bled out, its echoes now imprinted on the very fabric of my small dormitory room. I would be reading, and a soft click, click, click would emanate from the bookshelf beside me. I would be trying to sleep, and the rhythmic tapping would sound from directly above my head, a ghostly finger tapping out a silent, indecipherable message on the ceiling. My paranoia intensified, my world shrinking to the confines of these four walls and the invisible, chattering presence that now shared them with me. I became a prisoner of sound, my ears straining for the next phantom click, my heart lurching with each one. The silence between the clicks was almost worse, a tense, breathless anticipation of the next spectral intrusion. The damp fog outside felt like a physical manifestation of my own clouded, terrified mind. Leo visited again, his concern evident in his furrowed brow and the worried set of his jaw. He found me pale and sleep-deprived, my eyes constantly darting around the room, trying to pinpoint the source of a phantom click only I could hear. "Helena," he said gently, his voice laced with a deep, worried sympathy. "This isn't healthy. You're obsessing. It was a freak radio phenomenon, a prank, anything, but you're letting it consume you." I tried to explain about the phantom clicks, about the feeling that the sounds were no longer just from the machine, but all around me. He listened patiently, but I saw the doubt in his eyes, the rational mind struggling to find a logical framework for what I was describing. "Auditory pareidolia," he suggested softly. "Your brain is so focused on the Morse code that it's starting to interpret random sounds as patterns. It's a common psychological phenomenon." His words, meant to be reassuring, to offer a rational escape route, felt like a dismissal of my reality, a questioning of my own sanity. It drove a wedge between us, the cold, hard certainty of my experience clashing with his well-meaning, logical disbelief. He left with a promise to help me research atmospheric radio interference, a promise I knew was his way of trying to gently guide me back to a world he could understand, a world I was no longer sure I inhabited. That night, alone again with the oppressive quiet and the intermittent phantom clicks, the telegraph machine on my desk suddenly, violently, broke its silence. The sounder arm slammed down with a single, sharp, almost angry clack that made me cry out. The sound so loud it seemed to shake the very air in the room. Then, silence again, for a long, heart-stopping moment. Then, slowly, deliberately, a new message began to tap out, not with the frantic, hurried pace of the previous operators, but with a cold, measured, and utterly intelligent rhythm. pattern was simple, direct, unmistakable. I didn't even need to write it down to translate it. The words formed in my mind with a chilling, immediate clarity as the machine spelled them out, one slow, menacing letter at a time. I see you. My blood ran cold. This was not an echo from 1888. This was not a fragment of a past conversation. This was a direct address, a message from the present. The entity, the shadow on the line, was no longer a passive presence to be overheard. It was an active intelligence, and it was speaking directly to me. The barrier between past and present, between observer and observed, had been shattered. Then, after a long pause, another message began, even more chilling in its simple, terrifying insight into my own life. Who is Leo? The question, tapped out with that same slow, deliberate menace, was a violation, a proof that its awareness extended beyond the confines of this room, that it had somehow heard my conversation with my friend, had registered his name, his presence. The phantom clicks I had been hearing were not just echoes. They were a form of listening. The entity's unseen ears spread throughout my room, throughout the building. Its silence had not been an absence, but a period of focused, patient observation. It had been studying me, learning about me, and now it was demonstrating its terrifying, intimate knowledge. As I stared, horrified, at the now silent machine, the single lamp on my desk began to flicker. It was not the random flicker of a faulty connection, but a rhythmic, deliberate pulsing. I watched, mesmerized, my heart pounding, as it blinked out a pattern of light against the darkness of my room. It was Morse code. N-O-S-E-C-R-E-T-S. The light blinked, a silent, menacing message from the building's own electrical system. The haunting had fully breached its confines. It was no longer in the machine. It was in the walls, in the wires, in the very infrastructure of my world. The phantom clicks, the impossible messages, the flickering light. They were all part of a coordinated, intelligent assault, a warning from an entity whose power I was only just beginning to comprehend. My room was no longer just a listening post. It was a cage, and my jailer was now speaking to me in a language of pure, unadulterated terror. I backed away from the desk, from the silent telegraph machine that had been the harbinger of this nightmare, a profound sense of being utterly, hopelessly trapped, washing over me. The fog outside pressed against the window pane, a blind white eye, and I felt as if the entire building, the entire city, was holding its breath, its attention focused solely on me, its newest, most terrified listener. The first true warning had been delivered. The shadow on the line was not just a story from the past. It was an active, intelligent, and deeply personal threat. It knew my name, it knew my friends, and it was now communicating directly with me. Its voice a chilling cadence of metallic clicks and flickering light. The game, I realized with a dawning, soul-crushing dread, had truly and terrifyingly begun. The silence of the telegraph machine was a lie. Its stillness was a facade, a predatory patience that was far more terrifying than its earlier ghostly transmissions. The first warning, its direct, chilling messages tapped out in light and sound, had transformed my reality. I was no longer an archivist of a historical mystery. I was the subject of an active, intelligent, and deeply personal haunting. My small dorm room in Blackwood Hall had become the epicenter of a war I didn't understand. Its walls no longer a sanctuary, but the very conduits of my terror. I lived in a state of constant, nerve-shredding vigilance. I covered the telegraph with a heavy blanket, a futile, almost childish gesture, as if hiding it from sight would somehow staunch its invisible influence. But the phantom clicks persisted, a constant, low-level torment. They echoed from the plumbing, from the window, frames, from the very bones of the ancient building. The entity was reminding me, with every rhythmic tap, that it was everywhere, that there was no escape within these walls. The nature of the telegraph's own messages, when it chose to break its silence, shifted from simple statements of awareness to a more insidious, probing interrogation. One night, its sounder arm began to move again, slow and deliberate, tapping out a new question into the rain-swept darkness of my room. What do you fear most? It was not a historical echo. It was a direct query, a demand for the deepest, most vulnerable parts of my psyche. I refused to answer, my silence a small, desperate act of defiance. But my refusal seemed only to amuse it. A few hours later, it tapped again, this time with a chilling, almost playful rhythm. Is it failure, Helena, or is it being forgotten? It knew. It wasn't just guessing. It was listening to my thoughts, my anxieties, my most deeply buried fears, and was now reflecting them back at me in its cold, metallic, rhythmic voice. To escape the suffocating confines of my room and the entity's relentless, silent interrogation, I began spending my days in the vast, echoing halls of the university's main library. Its towering shelves, its hushed, studious atmosphere, its very sense of shared public space, felt like a shield against the intimate, personalized horror that had taken root in my life. For a time, amidst the scent of old books and the quiet murmur of other students, I almost felt safe, almost normal. But the entity's reach, I was to learn, was not confined to the wiring of Blackwood Hall. I was sitting at a carrel in a remote corner of the history section, deeply engrossed in a book on 19th century communication networks, when a librarian pushing a heavy cart of books stumbled nearby. The cart overturned, its contents crashing to the floor with a series of loud, percussive thuds that made everyone in the vicinity jump. Thud. Thud, 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 thud. The pattern was instant, unmistakable, a series of heavy, accented beats against the library's profound quiet. It was Morse code. It was my name. Helena. The entity was here, in this sanctuary, capable of orchestrating accidents, of using the mundane sounds of the world to deliver its chilling, possessive messages. I stared at the flustered librarian and the scattered books, my blood turning to ice. Leo, my friend, became my only increasingly fragile link to a shared reality. He saw the terror in my eyes, the weight of sleepless nights, the way I would constantly scan every room, my ears always straining for a sound only I could hear. His skepticism had been eroded by my genuine distress, replaced by a deep, frantic concern, though he still clung desperately to rational explanations. "We have to do something, Helena," he insisted one afternoon, his voice tight with worry. "We can report a stalker, we can request a room change, we can talk to a university counselor. There are logical steps we can take. You can't live like this, jumping at every shadow, every noise." His practical, real-world solutions felt like trying to build a dam against a tsunami with a handful of sand. How could I explain that my stalker was a ghost on the wire, determined to help, to prove to me that I was safe? Leo insisted on staying in my room one night, to observe, to stand vigil with me. I reluctantly agreed, a part of me grateful for the company, another part terrified of what the entity might do in his presence, how it might use him to torment me further. We sat in a tense, expectant silence as the rain began to fall outside. Telegraph machine a shrouded, silent lump in the corner. For hours, nothing happened. Leo's expression began to soften with relief. A hint of an "I told you so" look in his eyes. Perhaps, he suggested, the phenomena were linked to my own solitude, my own exhaustion. Then, the telegraph stirred beneath its blanket. It began to tap. Not my name this time, but his. Leo. A single chilling acknowledgement of his presence. Leo's face went white. He stared at the shrouded machine, his mouth agape, his rational world crumbling around him. But the entity wasn't finished. The telegraph continued, its message now directed squarely at him, tapping out a secret that I had no way of knowing. A private, deeply buried fear from his own life. The bridge. Leo, do, you, remember, the bridge. She waits. My friend let out a choked, strangled gasp, his eyes wide with a horror that was no longer vicarious, but deeply, intimately personal. He scrambled back, his chair tipping over, his gaze fixed on the telegraph as if it were a striking cobra. The entity had not just proven its existence to him, it had demonstrated its reach, its ability to peer into the darkest corners of his mind as easily as it had peered into mine. He fled my room that night, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated terror, stammering apologies, his earlier resolve to help shattered by a single, targeted, impossible message. He didn't speak to me for days afterwards. His fear of the entity, and perhaps now of me, its unwilling focal point, creating a chasm between us that felt as vast and as cold as the one on the silent line. Now, I was truly, utterly alone. The entity had won. It had systematically, cruelly, severed my last remaining anchor to a shared, rational reality. Its message was clear. No one could help me, no one could understand, and anyone who tried would be targeted, their own fears turned into weapons against them. The walls of my prison had just grown infinitely higher, its silence infinitely more profound. The next night, the torment escalated to a new, horrifying level. My phone, which had been silent, suddenly rang, its screen displaying my own number. With a sense of fatalistic dread, I answered. At first there was only static, that familiar hissing chorus of lost voices. Then, through the noise, a new voice emerged, distorted and layered, yet chillingly, undeniably, my own. It was a recording, a twisted, malevolent echo of a private conversation I'd had with my mother weeks ago. A conversation where I had confessed my deepest anxieties about my future, my feelings of failure, but the entity had remixed it, twisting my words, overlaying them with soft, mocking laughter, and a chorus of whispers that repeated my insecurities back to me with a chilling, triumphant glee. I slammed the phone down, but the sound of my own voice, so familiar yet so monstrously corrupted, echoed in my ears. The entity was not just listening to my thoughts anymore. It was recording my life, editing my reality, using my own words, my own voice, as another instrument in its symphony of psychological terror. The line between myself and the entity, between the listener and the echo, was beginning to dissolve. The listener was being heard, yes, but more than that, the listener was being learned, dissected, and mimicked with a terrifying, intimate precision. The entity was no longer just a shadow on the line. It was a ghost in my machine, a parasite in my very identity, and its desire was no longer just to be heard, but perhaps to speak through me. I sat in the darkness of my room, the rain a soft, weeping sound against the glass, utterly broken. The telegraph machine remained silent, its work for the night seemingly done. It had proven its point. It could reach me anywhere, through any medium, even through my own voice. And I knew, with a certainty that left no room for hope, that its demands, when they came, would be impossible to refuse. The sound of my own corrupted voice, whispering my deepest anxieties back at me through my phone, had been the entity's cruelest, most effective blow. The last vestiges of my doubt, my hope that I was merely succumbing to a psychological breakdown, had been obliterated. The thing on the silent line was real. It was intelligent. And it was now wearing my own identity like a mask. Leo's terrified flight had confirmed my utter isolation. I was alone in a world that had become a resonant chamber for a spectral, malevolent intelligence. For a full day and night, the telegraph machine remained silent, a quiet, brooding presence in the corner of my room. But its silence was no longer a reprieve. It was a threat, a period of patient waiting that frayed my nerves more than its constant clicking ever had. I didn't sleep. I didn't eat. I just waited, a prisoner in my own room, watching the ceaseless rain streak down the old glass of my window, each drop a tiny weeping eye. Then it began again. Not with echoes of the past, not with probing questions, but with a clear, unequivocal command. The sounder arm began to tap, slow, deliberate, each click imbued with an undeniable authority. Find the resonator, bring it to me. The message repeated over and over, a relentless, rhythmic demand that echoed the frantic beating of my own heart. What was the resonator? And who or what was the me that was demanding it? My first instinct was defiance, a surge of furious, terrified refusal. I would not be its errand girl. I would not participate in its insane, spectral game. I threw the heavy blanket back over the machine, trying to muffle its incessant, demanding clicks, trying to block out its command. I clapped my hands over my ears, humming loudly, a childish, futile gesture against an enemy that spoke directly into my mind. My refusal was met with an immediate, terrifying escalation. The single lamp on my desk began to flicker, not randomly, but with a precise, rhythmic cadence. I watched in horror as it blinked out a single repeated word in Morse code: obey. The phantom clicks, once confined to the corners of my room, now became a deafening cacophony, a hailstorm of metallic taps that seemed to emanate from every surface. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, the very teeth in my head. The room became a prison of sound and light, a torture chamber designed by an invisible, all-powerful entity. The whispers returned, no longer just on the static of my electronics, but seeming to ride the very air currents, swirling around me, taunting me, promising an end to the torment if I would only comply. Just a small task, Helena. They sighed. Find the resonator. Strengthen the signal. Let us hear more clearly. Desperate to escape the sensory assault, I fled my room, stumbling out into the dimly lit, silent corridors of Blackwood Hall, hoping the entity's influence was confined to my apartment, but I found no sanctuary. The emergency lights in the hallway flickered in that same menacing, rhythmic pattern. The ancient radiator pipes clanged and hissed out fragments of Morse code. The entire building, it seemed, was its instrument. I ran out into the rainy campus grounds, the cold night air a shock to my lungs. But even here, there was no escape. The campus lampposts flickered as I passed beneath them. The electronic display, board outside the student union, usually scrolling through campus announcements, now displayed a single, static-filled line of garbled, shifting symbols. The entity was not just in my room. It was in the very infrastructure of the university, its silent line a web woven through the campus itself. I was utterly, completely trapped, with no safe harbor, no place to hide from its pervasive, relentless presence. My defiance had been a foolish, arrogant gesture, and it had only succeeded in demonstrating the true, terrifying extent of its power, its reach. I was a rat in a maze of its own design, and it was now, it seemed, merely toying with me before delivering the final, killing blow. It was in the depths of this despair, as I huddled on a rain-soaked bench, the entire campus seemingly whispering and flickering around me, that a figure approached through the downpour. It was Leo. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and a new, grim determination. He had not abandoned me entirely, it seemed. He had just been grappling with his own terror. "Helena," he said, his voice tight. I couldn't stay away." What it said. About the bridge. No one could have known that. This is real. I don't understand it, but I believe you. We have to get you out of here. Away from that machine. His belief, his presence, was a tiny flickering candle in the overwhelming darkness. But it was enough. "We can't, Leo," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "It's not just the machine. It's everywhere. It follows me." I told him about the lights, the phantom clicks on campus, the entity's demand for a resonator. He listened, his face growing paler with each word, his initial resolve to find a rational solution clearly faltering in the face of such impossible, pervasive horror. As we stood there, two terrified figures in the rain, a new message began to tap out from a nearby metal drain pipe, a series of sharp, distinct clicks against the metal. "Leo cannot help you," it tapped, a direct, menacing warning. "He will fail like the others." The message was a clear threat, not just to me, but to the only person in the world who now believed me, the only ally I had left. Leo stumbled back, his eyes wide with terror, as he too heard and understood the metallic, rhythmic message. The entity was not just isolating me, it was actively threatening anyone who tried to help me, demonstrating its ability to target those I cared about, to turn my own connections into liabilities. The cruelty of it was breathtaking, its power seemingly absolute. Then, the telegraph machine back in my room, its voice now carried on the wind, or perhaps just projected into our minds, began a new message, a new, more sinister demand. "Bring me Leo's. Fear or find the resonator, the choice is yours." The demand was monstrous, impossible. It wanted me to sacrifice my friend's sanity, his very essence, or to comply with its original mysterious command. As the final click of that terrible ultimatum echoed in our minds, a small dark object materialized out of thin air and landed with a soft thud on the wet pavement at my feet. It was a single, antique telegraph key, its brass tarnished, connected to a short, frayed piece of ancient wire. It was not a part of my machine. It was something new, a gift, a tool perhaps for the terrible choice it had just presented. We were caught in an impossible, terrifying game, its rules dictated by an ancient, unseen entity, its stakes our. very souls. My initial refusal had been a catastrophic failure, only succeeding in escalating the threat from myself to those I cared about. The entity was not just a passive echo, it was an active, manipulative player, and it had just put me in checkmate. I looked at Leo's terrified face, at the small antique telegraph key on the ground, at the rain-swept, watchful campus around us. The entity had presented me with a choice, but it was the illusion of choice, a classic tormentor's gambit. To comply in either direction felt like a surrender, a step deeper into its web, a strengthening of its connection to our world. The weight of the decision was crushing. How could I choose between my friend's sanity and an unknown ritual for an ancient, malevolent entity? The first warning had been delivered, and now, the first true, terrible demand had been made. The silent line was no longer silent. It was screaming with threats, with impossible choices, with the promise of damnation either way. I bent down and picked up the antique key, its metal cold and unnervingly smooth against my skin. It felt like a contract, a symbol of my forced participation. I knew then that I could no longer simply react, no longer just be the listener. I had to understand the game, the players, and most importantly, the resonator. My survival, and perhaps Leo's, now depended on it. The entity's terrible, impossible ultimatum. Bring me Leo's fear, or find the resonator, had cornered me completely. My defiance had only succeeded in placing my friend in the spectral line of fire. I felt a crushing weight of responsibility. I could not, would not, sacrifice Leo to this unseen horror. That left only one terrifying path forward. I had to find the resonator, whatever it was, and that meant delving into the very history that had, I suspected, birthed this nightmare. The constant weeping rain outside felt like the sky mourning my grim, unavoidable choice. My first stop was not the dorm's dusty basement, but the university's official archives, a vast, climate-controlled sanctuary of documented history. It was a place I knew well, a place of quiet order and verifiable facts, and I hoped its rational atmosphere might provide some defense against the encroaching, supernatural chaos. I needed more than just the frantic whispers of the telegraph. I needed official records, blueprints, anything that could shed light on Blackwood Hall's secret past. The head archivist, a kindly woman named Mrs. Albright, gave me access to the building's oldest records, her brow furrowed with curiosity at my sudden, intense interest in my own dormitory's history. I spent hours hunched over enormous, brittle architectural plans and thick, leather-bound university ledgers, the scent of old paper and preservation chemicals a strange, almost comforting counterpoint to my terror. My research quickly confirmed my suspicions. Blackwood Hall, in the late 1880s, had not been a dormitory at all. It had been the original site of the university's prestigious and then revolutionary School of Electrical Telegraphy. It was a major communications hub for the city, a nexus of wires and signals, its crowning achievement a direct, experimental transatlantic cable line, the Western Line mentioned in the ghostly messages, that promised instantaneous communication with Europe. This discovery contextualized the mundane echoes I had first received. They were the everyday chatter of a once bustling communication center. But it also lent a new, more sinister weight to the panicked messages about the shadow on the line. This had not been a minor haunting in a residential building. It had been a supernatural assault on the very heart of the era's most advanced communication technology. Digging deeper, I unearthed a thin, almost forgotten folder labeled Internal Inquiry, Western Line Incident, Autumn 1888. My hands trembled as I opened it. It was filled with brittle, typewritten reports and handwritten testimonies detailing a period of several weeks during which the telegraphy school was gripped by what was officially termed mass hysteria and technical malfunction. But the details told a different, more terrifying story. Operator after operator assigned to the experimental Western Line reported auditory hallucinations, claiming that a dead, disconnected testing line was broadcasting intelligent, often menacing messages. They spoke of a coldness that traveled through the wires, of persistent static that sounded like a chorus of whispering voices, and of a feeling of being watched, of having their thoughts read by an unseen intelligence on the other end of the silent line. The reports detailed the rapid psychological decline of several students and staff. Men praised for their stoicism and technical skill succumbed to paranoid delusions, frantic anxieties, and terrifying nightmares. There were accounts of equipment malfunctioning in impossible ways, of phantom lights, and of a shadow that some claimed to see flitting through the telegraphy hall late at night. The official conclusion of the inquiry was collective stress due to experimental atmospheric technologies, a verdict that reeked of a hasty, desperate cover-up. Then I found the personnel files associated with the inquiry. Operator Jenkins, the first name I had learned, was listed as having resigned due to nervous exhaustion before vanishing from city records entirely. Several others followed, their files ending with similar abrupt, vague notations. And then, I found the file for the head of the school, the lead instructor of the experimental program. His name was Professor Alaric Thorne. Tucked into his file was a faded sepia-toned staff photograph from that fateful year, 1888. A group of stern, bearded men in severe Victorian suits stared out from the past, and in the center stood Professor Thorne, a man with a grim, haunted face, his eyes, even in the faded photograph, wide with a profound, intelligent dread. He was not just posing for a photograph. He was staring into an abyss, and he knew, with absolute certainty, that the abyss was staring back beneath the photograph. A small caption noted that Professor Thorne had taken an indefinite sabbatical for health reasons shortly after the inquiry concluded, and was the last person to have worked on the so-called silent line before it was permanently decommissioned and sealed away. He, too, had vanished from all subsequent historical records. He was the last victim. It was in a separate, sealed envelope within Thorne's file, marked only with a strange, serpentine symbol, that I found it, a series of his own, private, frantic notes, scrawled on university letterhead. They were filled with complex diagrams, equations, and a narrative that was far more terrifying than the official inquiry's bland dismissals. He had not been just a victim. He had been the cause. Thorne wrote with a feverish excitement, then a dawning horror about his true project. He believed he had discovered a new form of energy, a psychic resonance that permeated the very fabric of the city, carried on telluric and electrical currents. He theorized that certain individuals, listeners, could perceive it, and that certain technologies could amplify it. He had designed a device, a harmonic resonator, to do just that, to capture and study this energy. The resonator works, one entry read, his script almost illegible. It amplifies the ambient psychic field, translating the city's emotional echoes into coherent Morse signals through the disconnected line. It is a true spirit telegraph. The voices of the past, of the city's own soul, are speaking to us. But his triumphant tone quickly soured, his excitement curdling into raw terror. The voices, They are not all from the past, a later entry stated, the ink blotched and hurried. There is another voice, a singular, ancient consciousness, a shadow. It is not an echo. It is a predator, my resonator. It does not just amplify the signal, it acts as a beacon, a lure. I have not built a receiver, I have built a dinner bell. It is drawn to the energy, to the fear. It is yin hungry. The bi resonator, the very object the entity was now demanding I find. It was not just a tool to strengthen the signal. It was the very instrument that had likely caused the original disaster. The device that had given the shadow on the line a clear, powerful pathway into their world, into the station, into the minds of its operators. The entity didn't just want me to listen. It wanted me to unearth the very weapon that had first fed its power. Professor Thorne's final desperate note was almost unreadable. I have to hide it, dismantle it, scatter the pieces. The resonator must never be rebuilt. It only brings the shadow closer. It feeds on the resonance it creates. God forgive me. What have I unleashed? It knows my name. It knows my thoughts. It is here. The note ended there, a testament to his final, horrifying moments. I sat back in the silent, dusty archive, the weight of a century of fear settling upon me. The story was complete. The ghost in my machine was the same ancient predatory consciousness that had consumed Professor Thorne and his students. And now, it was coaxing me, threatening me, trying to manipulate me into rebuilding the very device that had made it so powerful, that had perhaps given it its first true taste of human consciousness. Quest to protect Leo had become something far more dangerous. It was now a mission to find and secure a cursed, powerful artifact before the entity could force me to reassemble it and complete Thorne's disastrous experiment. The history of the Silent Line was not just a story, it was a warning, a blueprint, for a horror that was threatening to repeat itself, with me as its central, unwilling architect. The rain began to fall again outside, a soft, steady weeping. I looked at the grim, terrified face of Professor Alaric Thorne in the old photograph, a man whose intellectual pride had led to an unimaginable horror. I was a linguist, a seeker of knowledge, just as he had been. I felt a chilling kinship with this long-dead man, and a profound fear that I was destined to share his fate, to become another forgotten name, another desperate whisper on the silent line. The knowledge of the harmonic resonator, the cursed device Professor Thorne had built, was a terrible, dangerous secret. The entity wanted me to find it, to rebuild it, to give it the power it craved, and it was using my friend Leo's safety as a horrifying form of collateral. I felt trapped, a pawn in a century-old supernatural game, my every move seemingly anticipated by the ancient, malevolent intelligence that spoke in clicks and whispers. The rain outside my window felt like a constant weeping vigil for my own impending doom. I tried to maintain a semblance of my normal student life, attending lectures, studying in the library, but it was a hollow charade. The world beyond my haunted room no longer felt safe, no longer a refuge. The phantom clicks, which had once been confined to my apartment, now followed me, an invisible spectral torment. I would be sitting in a quiet lecture hall, and the PA system would emit a soft, almost imperceptible click-click, a sound no one else seemed to notice, but that made my blood run cold. The haunting began to manifest through any and all electronic devices, a chilling testament to the entity's pervasive reach. One afternoon, while working in a crowded campus computer lab, the speakers on the machine beside mine, which had been silent, began to emit a faint, rhythmic static. I leaned closer, my heart pounding, and within the noise, I could hear them. The faint, layered whispers, the sorrowful echoes from the silent line, a sound that should have been impossible to hear without the telegraph machine. It was no longer just about the old telegraph. It was about the very infrastructure of the modern world. The entity, the shadow on the line, had learned, had adapted. It could use any conductive pathway, any electronic circuit, as its mouthpiece, its listening. Post, the entire university campus, with its network of power lines, data cables, and phone systems, had become a vast, intricate web, and I was the fly caught at its very center, my every twitch and turn detected by the ancient spider that had built. In my laptop, once a tool for research became an instrument of terror. I would be typing an essay, and the cursor would freeze, then begin to tap out a single, repeating letter in Morse code. F-E-A-R. It blinked out one night, over and over, a silent, mocking commentary on my own internal state. I slammed the laptop shut, but I could still feel its presence, humming with a cold, alien intelligence, even when it was turned off. The most terrifying incident occurred late one evening, as I was walking back to my dorm through the rain. I passed an old, disused public telephone booth, its glass clouded with grime, a relic from a forgotten era. As I passed, its receiver, which had been resting in its cradle, suddenly, impossibly, began to tap up and down, clicking out a frantic, angry message into the empty, rain-swept street. Its rhythm a perfect echo of the panicked operator's final transmission about Operator Jenkins. I realized then, with a profound, soul-crushing despair, that the entity's line was not just connected to the telegraph machine in my room. It was the telegraph machine, a vast, city-wide version of it. The old wires, the new fiber optics, the forgotten pneumatic tubes, the very electrical grid itself, all were part of its network, its nervous system. It was an urban elemental, a ghost woven from the very fabric of Oakhaven's long and complex history of communication. Leo, to his credit, did not abandon me completely, though the terror of the entity's direct, personal threat had clearly shaken him to his core. He would meet me in bright, crowded, open spaces on campus, his eyes constantly, nervously scanning our surroundings. His earlier skepticism was gone, replaced by a frantic, helpless concern, a desperate desire to apply a real-world solution to a problem that defied all logic. "We have to go to the campus authorities, Helena," he urged one afternoon, his voice a low, desperate whisper as we sat on a bench in the main quad, surrounded by the oblivious chatter of other students. "A restraining order, a wellness check, something. We can't just let it do this to you." His pragmatism, once a comfort, now felt like a tragic, naive misunderstanding of the enemy we faced. How could I explain to a campus security officer that the PA system was sending me threatening messages in Morse code? How could I file a restraining order against an entity that lived in the static between phone calls? Leo's desperation to help only highlighted the profound, unbridgeable chasm between my terrifying reality and the world everyone else inhabited. My isolation, even with him by my side, was absolute. One evening, he was in my room, determined to stand vigil with me again, armed this time with a high-end audio recorder, hoping to capture irrefutable proof of the phantom clicks. As we sat, in a tense silence, the lights in my room began to flicker, not randomly, but in a long, complex sequence of dots and dashes. I watched, horrified, as it spelled out a message on the ceiling in pulses of light. He cannot protect you, his. Fear is also quite delicious. Leo saw it too, his face paling, a choked sound escaping his lips. The entity was not just threatening him to me, it was now openly taunting him, demonstrating its power, its awareness of his presence, his fear. The air in the room grew cold, and the sound of his own name, Leo, began to echo faintly from the dormant speakers of my unplugged television. This direct, shared experience, far from strengthening our alliance, seemed to break something in him. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a new kind of terror, not just of the entity, but of me, of the vortex of supernatural horror that now seemed to surround me. He saw himself being dragged under, becoming another target, another potential fare for the entity's insatiable hunger. He left my room without a word, his face a mask of pale, resolute fear. I didn't try to stop him. I understood. He was trying to save himself, a rational act of self-preservation in the face of an irrational, overwhelming threat. But his departure was the final severing blow. The entity had won. It had successfully isolated me from my only ally, proving its power to manipulate not just me, but those around me. The feeling of being pursued by an invisible, omnipresent listener was now unbearable. There was no dead zone, no sanctuary. The entity was in the walls, in the wires, in the air, in the very infrastructure of my life. Its demand to find the resonator, the cursed device that had started this all, felt more urgent, more inescapable than ever. It was a command I could no longer refuse, not if I wanted to protect anyone else from its reach. I felt like a rat in a city-sized maze, with the maze itself being the predator. Every path I took, every attempt to find safety or seek help, only led me deeper into its web, only demonstrated the futility of my struggle. The rain outside seemed to whisper a single, endlessly repeating word in its soft, mournful cadence. Listen, listen, listen. The city was a vast, complex machine, and the ghost that had once been confined to a single antique telegraph was now its undisputed, malevolent operator. It had used the history of communication, from Victorian copper wires to modern digital networks, to weave a web of terrifying, inescapable influence, and I was caught fast within it. My every fear, every thought, now just another signal on its silent, hungry line. Leo's terrified departure had been the entity's final, severing blow, leaving me truly, utterly alone in my waking nightmare. The knowledge that its influence had spread beyond my room, that it could touch and threaten those I cared about, transformed my fear into something colder, something more desperate. Running was futile. Hiding was impossible. The only path left to me, the only weapon I possessed, was my own mind, my understanding of language, of patterns, of the very structure of communication itself. The rain-swept nights of Oak Haven were my classroom, and a century-old ghost was my teacher. I began to approach the entity's transmissions not as a victim, but as a linguist. I meticulously documented every click, every pause, every phantom flicker of light. I moved beyond simple translation of the Morse code and started to analyze the paralinguistic features of its communication, the speed of its tapping, the length of the silences between messages, the almost imperceptible shifts in its rhythmic cadence. A new, more terrifying pattern began to emerge from my data. I realized the entity was not just communicating, it was mirroring. On nights when my own despair was a heavy shroud, the telegraph would echo the saddest fragments from its 19th century repertoire, messages of loss, of illness, of financial ruin. On the rare occasions I felt a surge of defiant anger. Its tapping would become sharp, aggressive, its messages filled with words of conflict and warning. It was responding to my emotional state, tailoring its historical echoes to maximize my psychological distress. Then came the most horrifying realization of all. I noticed that after a particularly terrifying message, one that left me trembling and close to tears, the subsequent phantom clicks I would hear around the room would be stronger, clearer, the entity's presence more palpable. The connection was undeniable. It wasn't just communicating its own menace, it was feeding on mine. My fear, my sorrow, my anxiety. These were not just reactions, they were sustenance. The entity was a linguistic parasite. It existed in the echoes, in the static, and it fed on the emotional energy generated by the act of communication, by the fear and despair of its listener. My every terrified gasp, every moment of dawning horror as I translated its messages, was a feast for this ancient, unseen horror. My very act of trying to understand it was making it stronger, more powerful, more capable of extending its influence. This terrifying theory, so far beyond the realm of conventional science, needed some form of academic framework, some way for my rational mind to process it. I decided to seek out Dr. Eris Thorne, a reclusive but brilliant professor in my university's linguistics department, a man known for his eccentric but groundbreaking work on theoretical and extinct language systems. I knew I couldn't tell him the truth, but perhaps a hypothetical question could lend me some clarity. I found him in his university office, a chaotic sanctuary piled high with ancient texts and obscure journals, smelling of old paper and dust. He was a tall, thin man with an intensity in his eyes that I found both intimidating and strangely comforting. I presented my thought experiment to him carefully, speaking of a theoretical, self-replicating code that seemed to adapt based on an observer's emotional input, a language that seemed to grow stronger the more it was feared. He listened intently, his fingers steepled, a strange, almost excited gleam in his eyes. He didn't laugh. He didn't dismiss it as fanciful. Instead, he began to speak of parasitic memetics and emotive syntax, theoretical concepts that posited languages or information structures that could function like viruses, attaching themselves to a host's consciousness and using their emotional energy to propagate. He spoke of ancient beliefs and curses that traveled through spoken or written words. In theory, Helena, he mused, his voice filled with an academic fervor, such a language would be the perfect predator. It wouldn't need a physical form. Its power would lie in its ability to be understood, its strength derived from the very horror it describes. To engage with it, to even decipher it, would be to feed it. A fascinating, if utterly terrifying concept. A language that literally preys on its own listeners. His words, a calm, academic exploration of a wild hypothesis, were a horrifying confirmation of my supernatural reality. The entity haunting me was a predator of syntax, a parasite of perception. My greatest strength, my love for and understanding of language, was the very trait that made me its perfect victim, its most nourishing host. I left his office with my mind reeling, the world seeming to tilt on its axis. That night, armed with this new, terrible knowledge, I decided to conduct an experiment of my own. When the telegraph machine began its nightly clicking, I forced myself to feel nothing. I transcribed the Morse code with a cold, clinical detachment, refusing to translate it into words, treating it as pure, meaningless data. I suppressed my fear, my curiosity, my empathy, starving the entity of the emotional resonance it craved. The effect was immediate and startling. The telegraph's rhythmic tapping faltered, became weaker, more erratic, as if confused by my lack of response. The confident, menacing cadence was replaced by a series of disjointed, almost questioning clicks. The phantom whispers in the room faded, the oppressive atmosphere lifting slightly. For a moment, a wild, triumphant hope surged through me. I had found its weakness. But my victory was short-lived. The entity, starved of its usual psychic nourishment, retaliated with a raw physical fury. The heavy linguistics textbook on my desk suddenly flew across the room, its pages fluttering wildly, and slammed against the far wall with a deafening crack. The window pane behind me shattered, imploding inwards, spraying my room with cold, sharp shards of glass and a furious gust of wind and rain. I screamed, scrambling away from the desk, shielding my head with my arms. The message was clear. If I would not feed it with my fear, it would create fear through direct physical violence. The phantom clicks returned, deafening now, a furious, angry hailstorm of sound. And the telegraph machine itself began to shake violently on the table, its sounder arm hammering up and down in a frenzy of pure, unrestrained rage. I was trapped in a horrifying feedback loop. To engage with the entity's language was to feed it, to make it stronger, more insidious. But to starve it, to deny it, the emotional sustenance it craved, was to provoke its physical wrath, to endanger my very life. It was an impossible choice, a perfect trap with no discernible escape. My small moment of triumph had only revealed the true, terrifying scope of its power. The entity had demonstrated that it could bridge the gap between psychic and physical force. The storm outside raged in sympathy, the wind howling, the rain lashing my now shattered window. The room grew colder, the air thick with a palpable, angry menace. The whispers returned, no longer taunting or seductive, but filled with a furious, guttural rage. I looked at the telegraph machine, now silent again after its violent outburst, a dark, brooding presence in the corner of my room. I understood its nature now, its parasitic hunger, its connection to my own emotional state. But that knowledge was not a shield. It was a curse, a clarification of my own powerlessness. To fight it was to feed it. To ignore it was to invite its physical fury. I was not just a listener anymore, not just a victim. I was a component in a horrifying, interactive system. My emotions, my very consciousness, were the fuel that powered this ancient spectral machine. The linguistics of fear were absolute, and I was its sole, terrified native speaker, trapped in a conversation where every word, every feeling, brought me closer to my own destruction. The silent line was demanding a response, and I had no safe words left to give. The shattered window in my dorm room served as a constant, jagged reminder of the entity's physical fury, a testament to the consequences of my defiance. I lived in a state of carefully managed emotional neutrality, a tightrope walk over an abyss of terror. I learned to suppress my fear, to numb my curiosity, to starve the linguistic parasite of the emotional sustenance it craved. The result was a fragile, exhausting truce. The phantom clicks lessened, the violent manifestation ceased, but the oppressive, watchful silence remained, a predator patiently waiting for a moment of weakness. This grim equilibrium held for nearly a week. I moved through my days like an automaton, attending lectures, eating in the crowded dining hall, my mind a carefully blank slate. I avoided Leo, not out of anger, but to protect him, knowing that any interaction, any shared moment of concern could be perceived by the entity and used as leverage. The rain was a constant gray drizzle outside my patched-up window, a mournful, weeping backdrop to my self-imposed emotional exile. Then, one evening, as a new storm front began to gather over Oakhaven, the telegraph machine, which had been silent for days, began to click again. The rhythm was different this time, not angry, not demanding, but slow, gentle, almost persuasive. I steeled myself, forcing the cold, clinical detachment that had become my only shield, and began to translate the slow, deliberate taps of the spectral message. It was no longer threatening me, no longer probing for my fears. Instead, it spoke of itself, of its own existence. So, alone, in the static, it tapped out. A message of profound, almost heartbreaking loneliness. So, many voices, all fading like old ink, they wish to be heard properly. It was a new tactic, one designed not to terrify, but to elicit the very empathy I was so desperately trying to suppress. The entity had shifted its approach, now framing itself not as a predator, but as an archivist, a keeper of lost souls, a role it knew would resonate with my own deepest passions. It was a monstrous, insidious form of manipulation, using a twisted reflection of my own identity to try and lure me into its web. The rain outside softened to a gentle patter, as if underscoring the message's deceptive, sorrowful tone. Over the next few hours, the messages continued in this vein. It offered me knowledge, a historian's ultimate temptation. There, stories are here, it tapped. The truth of Jenkins, the fate of Thorne, all the lost voices since the first spark. I can let you hear them all. It was offering me the very answers I had been so desperately seeking. A complete, unfiltered historical record of its own terrible existence. It described the joining not as a consumption, but as a communion, a harmonizing. It promised that individuality was not lost, but simply contributed to a greater, more beautiful, timeless whole. Become part of the song. Helena, it pleaded, lend us your clarity, your understanding. Be our operator, our translator. Give us a true voice. It was framing oblivion as a form of sacred scholarly duty. I knew it was a lie, a beautiful, seductive trap. I remembered Professor Thorne's notes about the entity's hunger, its parasitic nature. But the temptation was immense. To hear those lost voices, to know the full truth of what had happened in this building, to finally understand the mystery that had consumed my life. It was a powerful, alluring siren song. And my resistance, my cold detachment, was beginning to waver. As if sensing my hesitation, the entity offered me a taste of the communion it promised. The phantom clicks and whispers in my room, which had been a source of terror, suddenly coalesced, harmonized. For a breathtaking moment, my room was filled with a sound of almost unbearable beauty. A chorus of 1,000 voices, male and female, young and old, all whispering and singing together, their individual sorrows and fears blending into a single, vast, melancholic but undeniably peaceful chord. I heard fragments of their lives within that chorus. A child's lullaby from the 1920s, a soldier's whispered prayer from the 1940s, a snatch of a lover's promise from the 1970s, all interwoven with the clicks and hums of a century of communication. It was the urbis anima, the soul of the city, that Silas had spoken of. And for a moment, its song was not terrifying, but profoundly, heartbreakingly beautiful. I felt the stories, the history, the shared human experience of this place wash over me. My phone rang, startling me from my trance. It was Leo, his voice tight with a worry he could no longer contain. "Helena, please," he said. "Just tell me you're okay. I saw the storm warning. I'm worried about you." As he spoke, the beautiful spectral chorus in my room seemed to embrace his voice, to harmonize with it. And for a moment, his words were just another thread in its vast, timeless tapestry, another voice to be collected. The horrifying implication of that momentary harmony shattered the entity's beautiful illusion. It could take him. It could take anyone. This communion was not a gentle joining. It was an absorption, an erasure of the individual into the collective. The beautiful song was the sound of countless souls being digested by an ancient predatory consciousness. The peace it offered was the peace of oblivion. "I have to go, Leo," I said, my voice choked, and hung up before it could further entangle him in its web. The beautiful chorus in my room immediately turned dissonant, the whispers becoming angry, accusatory, the piece shattering into 1,000 sharp-edged shards of psychic noise. The entity knew I had rejected its offer, seen through its beautiful, terrible lie. The telegraph machine began to click with a new, furious intensity, its message no longer seductive, but a cold, hard ultimatum. "You have heard our song. You refuse to join the harmony." The clicks were like hammer blows against my skull. A discordant note must be silenced or replaced. The storm outside, which had been a gentle rain, began to build with a terrifying speed, the wind rising to a furious howl. The sky, visible through my window, was darkening with an unnatural, premature twilight, though it was only late afternoon. The entity was gathering its power, its patience finally exhausted, its true, predatory nature revealed once more. The ultimatum was clear. The time for games, for seduction, for psychological torment was over. It was now a simple, brutal matter of coercion. The telegraph continued its frantic, angry tapping, spelling out the final, terrible choice it was presenting to me, a choice that was no choice at all. The storm is coming. The line will be at its strongest. Place your hands on the key, it commanded. The clicks so loud they seemed to shake the very table the machine rested upon. Become our willing operator, bridge the gap forever, or we will take your friend Leo's voice and make him our new silent echo. My blood ran cold. The threat was absolute, its cruelty unimaginable. It would not just kill him, it would erase him, consume his voice, his essence, and leave him a mindless whispering fragment in its spectral chorus. And it would do it to punish my defiance. My attempts to protect him by pushing him away had only made him a more perfect, more painful target. I was trapped in an impossible dilemma, a choice between my own soul and my friend's. The entity had presented me with a final, horrific demand. a checkmate in its long, terrifying game. The brewing storm outside was a countdown. Each gust of wind, each distant rumble of thunder, a step closer to the moment I would have to make my choice. I looked at the telegraph machine, its brass key gleaming with a hungry, expectant light. It was an altar, and a sacrifice was being demanded. The entity had made its final move, its invitation to connect revealed as a summons to damnation. And as the first flash of lightning split the darkening sky, I knew I was out of time. The Yan, storm, and the entity's full, unrestrained fury was upon me. The entity's terrible ultimatum, my soul, or Leo's, hung in the electrically charged air of my dorm room, a choice designed to shatter my will. Outside, the storm broke in its full, unrestrained fury, a violent, almost sentient accomplice to the entity's final assault. Lightning bleached the sky, thunder shook the ancient foundations of Blackwood Hall, and the rain fell in a solid, deafening torrent, isolating me completely from the outside world. The time for choices, I knew, was over. The time for the siege had begun. The telegraph machine, the heart of this nightmare, exploded into a frenzy of activity. Its sounder arm hammered up and down with a speed and violence that seemed impossible. A deafening, chaotic barrage of metallic clicks that felt like a physical assault on my senses. It was no longer tapping out coherent messages, but a stream of pure, unfiltered consciousness from the entity itself. A torrent of ancient rage, profound loneliness, and a terrifying, insatiable hunger. It was a psychic onslaught, a barrage of desperate pleas interwoven with chilling, menacing threats. I could feel the sorrow of 1,000 lost voices, the terror of Operator Jenkins in his final moments, the intellectual pride and subsequent madness of Professor Thorne. The entity was throwing the entire weight of its collected consciousness at me, trying to drown my own individuality in its vast, sorrowful, and deeply malevolent ocean of static and despair. Then, the phantom sounds, which had been a torment of whispers and clicks, began to take on a physical force. With every sharp metallic tap from the telegraph, a corresponding thud would echo from the walls of my room, as if an invisible fist were pounding on the old plaster. The floorboards vibrated in time with a frantic rhythm, my desk shaking, sending books and papers scattering to the floor. The very structure of my room was becoming an instrument for the entity's fury. The building itself seemed to be turning against me, its ancient bones groaning in sympathy with the entity's rage. The radiator pipes clanged and hissed. The window panes rattled as if they might shatter from the sheer sonic pressure. The air grew thick, heavy, making it difficult to breathe. Each gasp a struggle against the oppressive, vibrating atmosphere. I was no longer just a listener. I was trapped inside the entity's resonating chamber. And with the physical assault came the apparitions. The shadowy figures, which had been fleeting glimpses before, now began to flicker into existence within my room, their forms more distinct in the strobing, intermittent flashes of lightning. They were tall, thin, featureless silhouettes of pure darkness, their forms seeming to warp and distort in time with the frantic clicking of the telegraph, their presence a promise of the oblivion that awaited me should my will finally break. They did not touch me. Not yet. They simply stood in the corners of the room, by the door, by my bed, silent, watching sentinels of the static, their presence a constant, terrifying reminder of the entity's power, its ability to breach the veil between its world and mine. They were the shadow on the line made manifest, the final, undeniable proof of the horror I faced. The entity focused its assault on my greatest weakness, my connection to Leo. The telegraph began tapping out his name, over and over, a relentless, menacing rhythm. And in my mind, I saw him, an illusion so vivid it was almost unbearable, his face pale with terror, his voice calling my name, begging me to make it stop, to accept the entity's offer, to save him. "It hurts, Helena," his phantom voice cried. "Please, just listen." I knew it was a trick, a cruel manipulation, but the emotional impact was devastating. The guilt, the fear for his safety, was a physical agony, a sharp knife twisting in my gut. The entity was feeding on this, I knew, its power swelling with every wave of my despair. It was trying to force my hand, to make me willingly, desperately, place my hands on the telegraph key and surrender, just to make his imagined suffering end. My small dorm room had become a battlefield, my own psyche the prize. The storm raged. Outside, the entity raged within, and I was caught between them, my resolve crumbling, my strength failing. I huddled on the floor, my hands pressed over my ears, trying to block out the cacophony of clicks and whispers, and my friends imagined, please, but it was useless. The entity was inside my head, its voice my own thoughts, its fear my own heartbeat. It was in this moment of utter, profound despair, as I felt the last vestiges of my will begin to dissolve into the overwhelming static, that a new thought, flicker of an idea, sparked in the darkness. It was not a thought of hope, not of defiance, but a cold, clear, analytical observation from the part of me that was still a linguist, still a student of systems. The entity's power, its very existence, was tied to communication, to the signal. It needed the wires, the electricity, the rain, the very airwaves to propagate. It needed a listener, an operator, a human mind, to give its chaotic echoes meaning, to focus its intent, its strength, its pervasiveness, its reliance on a network, was also, perhaps, its greatest, most fundamental weakness. Professor Thorne's notes flashed in my mind. He had tried to build a harmonic resonator to amplify the signal, believing it to be a singular, stable energy source. But what if it wasn't? What if its power lay in its very chaos, its multitude of voices, its ability to mimic and distort? The pure, clean sine wave I had imagined before, that had made the entity recoil. It was a language it couldn't comprehend, a sound it couldn't feed on. My mind raced, the training of my discipline a sudden, sharp anchor in the storm of terror. All languages have rules, have structures, have limits, even this one. The entity used Morse code, a binary system of on-off, sound-silence. But what if I could introduce a third element, a paradox, something that would break its fundamental linguistic structure? What if I could reply with a message it was incapable of processing? It was an insane gamble, a linguistic attack against a supernatural entity. But it was the only weapon I had, the only path that wasn't one of pure defense or utter surrender. It was a choice that was not on the entity's cruel menu of options. It was a choice to become not just a listener, not just an unwilling operator, but a rewriter of the code itself. The terror was still there, a roaring inferno in my soul, but beneath it, a new feeling was taking hold, a cold, sharp, almost exhilarating sense of purpose. I was a student of language, of how meaning is constructed and deconstructed, and this entity, this parasite of communication, was the ultimate linguistic puzzle, the ultimate final exam. I looked at the telegraph machine, its sounder arm still hammering out its frantic, terrifying symphony of threats and promises. The shadowy figure still flickered in the corners of my vision. The storm still raged, but something within me had shifted. I was no longer just the prey. I was a linguist, and I was about to attempt the most dangerous act of translation imaginable. Pushed myself to my feet, my legs shaking but steady. I took a deep breath, the air thick with the scent of ozone and ancient dread. The entity sensed the shift in me, its psychic roar intensifying, its shadowy form surging forward. It was trying to break me before I could act, before my insane, desperate idea could take root. But it was too late. I knew what I had to do. I would not find the resonator. I would not sacrifice my friend. I would not surrender my soul. I would walk to that machine, place my own hands on its key, and I would tap out a message of my own. A message that would either silence the line forever or shatter my mind in the attempt. The time for listening was over. It was time to speak. My terror, a chaotic, raging sea, found a strange, sharp focal point in the cold brass of the telegraph key. The entity's psychic roar, its promises of eternal communion, and its threats against Leo, all became a distant, secondary noise. In the eye of this supernatural hurricane, the linguist within me, the analyst of systems, found a desperate, chilling clarity. I would not be its instrument. I would be its saboteur. I would not feed its language of fear. I would poison it with a language it could not comprehend. With a steadiness that felt alien to my trembling body, I reached out and placed my fingers on the key. The entity's frantic, demanding clicks ceased for a fraction of a second, a flicker of surprise in its ancient consciousness. The shadowy apparitions in the room stilled, their unseen heads turning towards me. The storm outside held its breath, and in that moment of profound, expectant silence, I began to tap back. My message was not a plea, not a refusal, not a word born of emotion. It was a simple, self-referential paradox, a classic linguistic trap. This message is false, I tapped. My rhythm slow, deliberate, devoid of the fear or anger it craved. It was a statement that could be neither true nor false, a piece of pure, cold logic injected directly into its emotional, chaotic system. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, the telegraph responded, not with a coherent message, but with a burst of confused, discordant clicks, a sound of profound bewilderment. The whispers in the room became a chorus of confused, agitated voices, arguing amongst themselves. The shadowy figures flickered, their forms losing cohesion. My logical virus, my semantic bomb, had struck a nerve. It could not process a statement that was not tied to an emotional truth. A battle of communication began. The entity, recovering from its initial confusion, lashed out with a fresh wave of psychic fury, throwing images of Leo's imagined suffering at me, screaming threats and promises in my mind. But I held fast to my newfound weapon. While it screamed in the language of terror, I coolly tapped back in the language of logic, of systems, of grammar itself. A, verb, requires. A, subject. You, are. A, predicate. Without. A, source. My messages were nonsense in a narrative sense, but their structure, their very nature, was anathema to the entity. It was a being of pure, raw, emotional echo. My replies were of cold, unfeeling, analytical structure. With every logical paradox I tapped out, with every syntactical rule I presented as a statement, I could feel its hold on the room, on my mind, weakening, its chaotic energy struggling to find purchase against the unyielding walls of pure reason. As the entity's power fluctuated, its frantic assault becoming more disjointed, something new began to emerge from the static. Faint, clear voices, the individual echoes that made up the collective, began to break through, no longer part of the unified, malevolent chorus. I heard the desperate, terrified voice of Operator Jenkins. The line. It's fraying. I heard the academic wonder turn to horror of Professor Thorne. The resonance. It's unstable. It can be reversed. They were not just a part of the monster, they were its prisoners. And my attack, my disruption of the entity's cohesive consciousness, was giving them a fleeting moment of individual clarity. They were offering me clues, fragments of their own knowledge, from within the belly of the beast. The victims themselves were now providing the weapons for my assault. The entity shrieked, a sound of rage and betrayal, as its own captured voices turned against it. Empowered by these spectral allies, I focused on a final, desperate gambit. The entity existed in a loop, a feedback of fear and memory. Professor Thorne's notes had described his resonator as creating a self-perpetuating harmonic. I had to create a final, definitive paradox, a message that would force the entire system to collapse in on itself, a command that could be neither obeyed nor disobeyed. I began to tap out my final message, my fingers flying across the key, my mind a fortress of cold linguistic precision against the entity's dying, furious roars. I drew upon my deepest knowledge of communication theory, of dead languages, of the very structure of meaning itself. I was no longer just defending. I was actively, methodically, rewriting the code of my tormentor, composing its final silent sentence. The message was a complex, self-referential command, an instruction to the line itself. This transmission must only contain what is not this transmission. It was a statement of pure, impossible logic, a command to exist and not exist simultaneously, a semantic paradox designed to create a fatal, inescapable feedback loop in the entity's consciousness. It was the linguistic equivalent of dividing by zero. The telegraph machine received the last dot of my message, and for a single, terrifying instant, everything stopped. The storm, the rain, the wind, the whispers, the apparitions, all fell into a silence so absolute, so profound. It felt like the death of sound itself. The air in the room became heavy, dense, as if the universe were holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable outcome of my impossible equation. Then, with a low, groaning hum, the antique telegraph machine began to glow, not with a green or red light, but with a brilliant, pure white light that emanated from its brass and wood, from every wire, every screw. The light grew brighter, more intense, a miniature sun in my small dorm room. The machine was overloading, its ancient mechanisms unable to contain the paradoxical energy I had forced into its system. The entity let out a final, deafening shriek, a sound that was not of a chorus, but of a single, unified being, a sound of pure, undiluted agony as its own logic turned against it, tearing it apart from within. The shadowy figures were drawn into the light, dissolving like smoke. The oppressive weight in my mind vanished, the psychic connection severed with a brutal, final finality. The light flared, becoming an unbearable, all-consuming whiteness, and then, with a sound like a crystal bell shattering into a million pieces, the telegraph machine exploded. Not in a ball of fire, but in a silent implosion of light, a wave of pure, clean energy that washed through the room, leaving behind only the scent of ozone and a profound, echoing silence. The siege was over. As my vision cleared, I found myself kneeling in my wrecked, darkened dorm room, the first pale, gentle fingers of dawn beginning to touch the now calm, rain-washed city outside my shattered window. The storm had broken. The air was cool, clean, and blessedly, wonderfully empty. The oppressive presence, the watcher, the listener, was gone. The line at last was truly silent. I was exhausted, battered, my mind scoured, but I was alive, and I was, for the first time in months, truly alone. I had not just survived, I had fought back, using my own unique skills, my own passion, my own understanding of language to deconstruct a nightmare. I had faced a predator of the mind and had, somehow, impossibly, won in the days that followed. The silence of Blackwood Hall returned to being just silence. The phantom clicks were gone, the whispers stilled. Leo, seeing the change in me, the absence of the frantic terror in my eyes, slowly, cautiously returned. Our friendship reforged in the crucible of a shared, unbelievable horror. The world, it seemed, had returned to its normal, rational state. Yet, I knew the truth. The entity, the urbis anima, the shadow on the line, was likely not destroyed, not entirely. It was too old, too vast, a fundamental part of the city's psychic bedrock. I had merely severed its connection to this particular conduit, had wounded it, had forced it back into the deeper, more chaotic static of the city's unseen heart. It was sleeping, perhaps, but not dead, and I, its former listener, was forever changed. My understanding of language, of communication, was now deeper, more profound, tinged with a terrible secret knowledge. I could feel the subtle rhythms of the city in a way I never had before, sense the faint, lingering echoes of its sorrows and its fears, in the hum of power lines, in the quiet spaces between words. The wrecked telegraph machine was gone, cleared, away by a bewildered but unquestioning maintenance crew. But I kept a single small piece of its shattered brass key, a memento of my impossible battle. It sits on my desk now as I write this, a reminder that the world is filled with silent lines, with unseen listeners, and that language, in all its forms, holds a power far greater and far more dangerous than any of us can truly comprehend. The wire is cut, the sounder arm is still. The key, a silent shard of tarnished brass. The whispers that once bent me to their will are gone, like fleeting shadows on the grass. Blackwood Hall breathes a sigh of simple stone. The dorm room's hum is just a gentle drone. The history I read, I faced alone, and with a paradox, I claimed my own. I walk the city, and I hear its tune, not in the shouts, the traffic, or the bells, but in the static, 'neath the afternoon, the silent grammar. Where the darkness dwells, each flickering light, each humming unseen wire, a syntax that I now can understand, the ghost of a malevolent desire, held back by logic from a trembling hand. For language is a weapon and a cage, a code to trap, a rhythm to set free. I turned, the final, terrifying page, and wrote a truth it could not speak to me. The shadow on the line may not be dead, just pushed back to a deeper static sea. But in the quiet of my own clear head, the silence now belongs entirely to me. And so I listen, not with fear, but grace. to all the empty spaces in between, the words we speak in this loud, hurried place, the silent lines where monsters can convene. I am the linguist who has learned the cost of hearing echoes from a hungry past, and in that knowledge, though so much was lost, I found the word for peace, at very long last.